From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro, and this is The Daily. Just kidding. From Centennial, Colorado, this is Katie Lee, CGC, and today I'm talking about that New York Times article and the podcast that came out today on The Daily. And I have to say, I'm a Daily supporter. I've been listening to The Daily for years. I listen to it every morning when I'm showering and getting ready, and I love it. But The Daily's podcast that dropped today, which was titled An Investigation into Flawed Prenatal Tests today, January 4th, was not it. I've got lots of commentary and feedback, and I'm going to try to channel all of my favorite MLM commentators. If you know me, you know I love talking about a good multi-level marketing scam. We can talk about Arbonne. We can talk about Unique, Shakeology, Beachbody. I don't know. I could talk about any MLM. So anyways, I'm trying to channel some of my favorite YouTubers. I'll list them down below if you're curious about MLMs, and critique this New York Times article and podcast. If you want to take a listen to the podcast, read the article, they're linked down below. They're right here. I encourage you to do so. But what I want to do today is give a genetic counselor's perspective. And I don't represent all genetic counselors. This is my voice as a reproductive genetic counselor, as a woman who has just used non-invasive prenatal testing for my pregnancy for my 4-month-old Frenchie. I'm both a customer of one of the big NIPT labs, Natera, as well as somebody who's worked for a laboratory, not any of those that are mentioned in the article, but a lab that does genetic testing, including testing like NIPT, and a genetic counselor, someone who counsels patients on their genetic testing. What I'm going to do today is talk more about the podcast. I'm going to explain some of the things they got wrong, some of the things they got really wrong, some of the things they got a little bit wrong, and how I wish New York Times would have reported on non-invasive prenatal testing. So I'm going to have a drink. I'm going to play the podcast. I'm going to share my comments on it. And you guys, today was my first day back at work at Seattle Sperm Bank. So it's just a big day. This interesting podcast came out. I started work again. So here we go. I got to get back into YouTube because the time is right.
Today, over the past decade, medical companies have begun offering pregnant women new screening tests that promise to detect rare genetic disorders in their fetuses.
Okay, these screening tests in the advertisement I've seen, and as a genetic counselor, I would never say that they promise to detect rare genetic diseases. It's more like they can detect relatively common chromosome imbalances like Down syndrome. And depending on the brand, some of them do have an ability to add on and also look for really rare genetic syndromes, just a handful of them, but they don't promise to catch them.
What those women weren't told was that if they tested positive, there would be a high likelihood that the result would be wrong. A Times investigation reveals how tests that promise peace of mind have instead caused anguish and confusion. I spoke with my colleague, Sarah Kliff. It's Tuesday, January 4th.
At 10:30 p.m., and my kid might wake up any moment.
So, Sarah, how did you come to this story?
Yeah, I usually cover medical billing for the Times, and readers often send me odd, surprising bills they've received. And I'd received a handful for this certain type of prenatal test, and they were hundreds to thousands of dollars. So I was looking into the bill.
Okay, now this is true. Prenatal testing, like this test that they're going to be referencing, NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, it can end up costing people thousands of dollars out of pocket, which is ridiculous. It should never cost that much. In fact, there are many companies that offer self-pay prices. That's what I've used, where you can pay for the testing and just pay $350 without going through your insurance. But unfortunately, it does happen that sometimes when you go through insurance, because our healthcare system is so effed up in the United States, you can end up with a bill for thousands of dollars still. So I'm not surprised that she had that experience, and I hate that that happens to people.
And my editor suggested just looking into what these tests are in the first place. So I just started doing the basic research that I usually do, reading some academic studies, looking through people's experiences with them online. And I came across a Reddit community focused on this type of screening and just kept seeing the same kind of story repeated again and again, where someone who was pregnant went to the doctor, took this particular type of screening test, and was really surprised to get a positive result for a disorder they had never heard of. And they, often talked about a really agonizing month between this first screening and a follow-up test that was either going to confirm or disprove the original results. And in the end, it turned out that the original test was wrong, and there's actually nothing wrong with the pregnancy. And they went on to have babies without the conditions that they had screened positive for. And so that kind of, piqued my interest a little bit to think, what is going on here, and why are so many women reporting this type of story?
So what exactly is this test?
Okay, I'm just going to pause here to talk about this Reddit community, because I think it's so interesting that there are all of these communities on the internet, on Reddit, on Facebook, big groups of people who have a specific genetic disease and have questions about it, or people who don't understand different types of genetic testing results, or people who did 23andMe and want to understand more about their results. I think it would be so amazing if we could somehow get genetic counselors into these groups to answer people's questions correctly and explain some genetic concepts correctly, and to get paid for doing that. Wouldn't that be great? Okay, now let's hear what the genetic test is, and I'll kind of give my definition after.
So this test, it's known as a few things. It's known as cell-free DNA screening, or non-invasive prenatal testing, and it's usually drawn at a doctor's office.
It's also known as NIPS, non-invasive prenatal screening. It's known by a lot of different brand names like Maternity 21 or Panorama. The list could go on.
Office or a laboratory. And this is a test that screens for chromosomal abnormalities in a fetus. And before this test existed, this was done, with a number of ultrasounds, a number of blood draws over multiple prenatal visits to mostly screen for Down syndrome. And they produced a decent number of false positives. And then about 10 years ago, this test comes along. It can be done at 10 weeks. It just requires one blood draw. And it turns out to be really quite accurate at screening for Down syndrome. And it's a pretty remarkable advancement.
So were these tests well received? It seems as if they are providing a real niche to streamline that screening process.
Yeah, they really are. Obstetricians are happy with them because they feel like they are able to provide a service to their patients. They're not having to do as many invasive procedures like an amniocentesis. So they're pretty happy with the technology. Patients are happy with.
Whoa, hold up there. So non-invasive prenatal testing, that is a test, again, that it's not invasive. There's no risk to the pregnancy. The person who wants the testing, that pregnant person, all they need is a blood draw. That blood is sent off to a lab. And using that blood sample, depending on what's selected by the physician, by the patient's OB or midwife, you can test for a variety of things. So usually what's almost always included on the screen is testing for Down syndrome that's caused by an extra copy of 21. Most people have 2 copies of each chromosome, including 2 copies of chromosome 21. If you have 3 copies, you're affected with Down syndrome, also called trisomy 21. Also screens for trisomy 18 and trisomy 13 standardly. In addition, almost all of these tests screen for sex chromosome imbalances. Those syndromes can be variable. They usually look milder than Down syndrome, but can also cause physical differences and sometimes an increased risk for learning differences as well. And then what this article is really getting into is that as these tests have evolved, and this is kind of the case, whether we like it or not with all genetic testing, that there's this kind of more is better thought. And I think that's thought for a lot of consumers and for a lot of OBs as well. So laboratories have started adding on the option to test for much, much rarer syndromes. The syndromes that are much rarer, they're called microdeletions or microduplication syndromes. This is when you have not a whole extra or whole missing chromosome, but rather just a small extra piece or a small missing piece, a small deletion within one of the chromosomes. And these syndromes are much more rare, but if you add them up all together, they're not that rare. Even though the testing is not as good, it's not as accurate when we screen for those little microdeletions and microduplications, it has been made available. And of course, we're in this age where genetic testing is advancing so quickly, and there are sometimes tests that are released that don't have an amazing accuracy or amazing positive predictive value. And that's the case specifically when we think about these small microdeletions and duplications that are included on this test. But I would not think about those the same as I would think about using this test, non-invasive prenatal screening, to look for things like Down syndrome, trisomy 18, and trisomy 13. It is still, in my opinion, a great test for that. And I used it again for my own pregnancy just less than a year ago.
Because it can also screen for what your baby's sex is at 10 weeks. That's something.
The reporter just said that it can screen for what your baby's sex is. Truthfully, it's screening for the number of sex chromosomes. So what this test is doing is it's telling you, was the pregnancy detected to have 2 X's, or was it predicted to have an X and a Y, or was it predicted to have a sex chromosome difference, like maybe 2 X's and a Y that causes a specific syndrome called Klinefelter syndrome?
Thing you before this couldn't know till about 20 weeks pregnancy.
Oh, wow.
So obstetricians found patients were coming into their offices, asking, I want the test that screens for sex. So they were quite well received. And you saw.
Okay, patients do come into their doctor's office and say, I want the sex test. And the problem is a lot of OBs are ordering the test and just saying, oh, sure, we can get you the sex test. The issue is this test is not designed to tell you what sex chromosomes your baby has. This test is much bigger than that. The main goals of this test of NIPT are to tell you, does your pregnancy have an increased risk to have Down syndrome, to have trisomy 18, to have trisomy 13, to have a sex chromosome imbalance? And if you add on the microdeletions or microduplications, does your baby have an increased risk to be affected with one of those syndromes? So when people order the test thinking all they're going to find out is the sex of their baby, that is a big mistake, in my opinion, on the provider. The provider is responsible for explaining what testing they're ordering for their patient and making sure that their patient consents to it. So if a patient comes in and says, oh, I'm so excited, I need to find out the sex of the baby, me and my partner are just dying to know, so we want the sex test, can you order it? The provider should stop that patient and say, it's great you want to find out the sex chromosomes. First of all, you should know that the sex chromosomes are not 100% accurate, and that's not going to predict the gender of your baby. But also, this test is much bigger than looking at the sex chromosomes. It's actually a test that's primarily used to screen for chromosome imbalances like Down syndrome. And then a patient might say, you know what, I don't want to screen for Down syndrome. Well, then maybe that test isn't right for you. So the thing about genetic testing these days is it's very nuanced. It looks for different things in different ways, and tests aren't simple. Genetic tests just aren't simple. In order for patients to understand genetic testing and what's actually being done with their blood sample or saliva sample, a long discussion is required. That's why genetic counseling is growing. But genetic counselors don't need to be the only ones having these conversations. OBs can learn the material and have the conversations too. Lots of different healthcare providers can have these conversations, but the conversations have to be had. It is a responsibility of the provider to make sure that their patient that they're ordering a test on understands what's being ordered and what the possible results will be.
Companies realizing there was a market in this type of testing. About 4 million women give birth each year. And that was 4 million women who could, potentially use this type of screening product. So after the first test launches in 2011, you really quickly see about a half dozen other companies trying to get into this space. Some of them are big laboratory companies like LabCorp, for example, which buys a test called Maternity 21 from a smaller biotech startup. A company called Natera gets into this space and they quickly become the market leader. Quest Diagnostics, Myriad.
I'm just going to pause there because Natera's test called the Panorama, that's a brand of NIPT. It's one of the most widely available types of NIPT, and that is what I've had done. And I'm a big fan of Panorama's NIPT results. I'm going to link my video in the description right here where I go through my results report with my last pregnancy. And I walk through all of the things that your provider should be walking through about positive predictive rate and what each result really means.
These are all different companies getting into the space. And they are looking at ways to differentiate their products. And one of the things that starts to happen is they start screening for conditions that are rarer than Down syndrome. They start with something called trisomy 13 and trisomy 18. And then they move into a new category of testing for microdeletions, which are kind of small missing pieces of chromosomes. And those microdeletions are sometimes associated with certain syndromes. Some of the better known ones are DeGeorge syndrome, which becomes a screening, Creta-Shott, Engelmann, and Prader-Willi. They tend to be pretty rare, so they are often not familiar to patients, but these are the things that are starting to be added on to this type of screening.
Now, I'm not familiar with any lab that just adds it on automatically. So the way that this is being described is that these laboratories have just willy-nilly one day decided, oh, yesterday we were just screening for Down syndrome, trisomy 18 and trisomy 13, and today we're going to screen for a bunch of microdeletion syndromes that have a lower accuracy. No, that's not what's really happening. The OBs who order the testing check a box. At least this is what I've seen for all of the test requisition forms or those forms where you order the testing. They check a box that says, do you want to add on these syndromes or not? So it's not as if the lab's in charge. It's actually the provider who is in charge of selecting what they want to screen for. And the provider should be making that decision after consulting their patient.
They also get marketed directly to patients, directly to doctors as, quite accurate products. You start seeing language like total confidence in every result or information for your peace of mind. They say they're going to give you clear answers, clear positives and negatives, and kind of information you can trust. And you get to the point where in 2020, a third of pregnant women, that's over 1 million people, are getting the Down screening with the sex test. Some share of those, we don't know exactly.
Don't like it being called the sex test.
How many are getting the expanded tests that are looking for the rarer conditions. But the problem that I found in my reporting is when it comes to those newer expanded tests, the problem is that the positive results on those tests, they are often wrong.
So what exactly did you find?
Okay, I just want to pause here and talk a little bit about what she said about the genetic test being marketed directly to patients and directly to OBs. That's true. We have this huge problem, in my opinion, in genetic testing that a lot of genetic tests, whether they're direct to consumer tests that a consumer can have done without a doctor like 23andMe, or whether they're things like this non-invasive prenatal testing that must be ordered by a doctor, they are extensively marketed to patients. And unfortunately, a lot of companies do use language that is too black and white when genetic testing is such a nuanced topic. And I definitely felt that depending on the companies that I've worked for in the past, that there's this tug from marketing to make the test sound simple and clean and easy and straightforward. But there's this pushback from genetic counselors and physicians who understand the product saying, whoa, it's not that straightforward. It's never a guarantee. There's never 100% accuracy. It's never black and white with genetic testing. There are always caveats, always, always, always. So yeah, that's a problem, but it's not a problem that's unique to non-invasive prenatal testing. It's around with every single type of genetic testing that exists.
Yeah. So before I get into the findings, I think it's just important to have some context. One is that the test is still quite reliable for Down syndrome when it's screening for that condition.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a great screening tool for Down syndrome or for trisomy 21. Still, never is it a guarantee. If you get a normal result or a low risk result in NIPT, it is not a guarantee that your baby is unaffected with Down syndrome. It's just extremely unlikely that your baby or your pregnancy is.
And second, most people who take this test are going to screen negative on it. Most people will not get a positive result. But for the people who do get a positive result, there's about a half dozen tests where we found that those positive results are wrong about 85% of the time.
All right, now the fact that these tests are wrong 80% of the time for people who get a positive result, that may sound alarming, but depending on the specific lab and the specific condition, that is a fact. That is true right now. That's where we're at with the technology. The issue here, and where I think New York Times misses the mark, is that just is where we are in science right now. These things that we're trying to screen for, are incredibly rare. And we do get results back on this type of testing that say somebody's at an increased risk, but they end up having a perfectly healthy pregnancy, a pregnancy unaffected with these conditions. And the thing is, if you explain to patients, if you take the time to explain to patients, and I can say this as a genetic counselor in my experience, take the time to explain to patients, okay, we've got a few different options for your prenatal screening. You can do nothing. That's absolutely your choice. You could just do ultrasounds and see if we ever see anything different than typical on ultrasounds that could suggest a chromosome syndrome. You can do screening. You can do screening like non-invasive prenatal screening, where we take a sample of your blood, and that blood sample is used to see if there could be an increased risk to have a baby with Down syndrome with trisomy 18. And if you'd like, we can even include these really rare syndromes called microdeletion syndromes or microduplication syndromes. Now, the caveat is with these syndromes, we aren't that great at screening for them yet. What I mean by that is a lot of people get a positive result, a result that says they have an increased risk. And actually, when they do follow-up testing, the baby is perfectly fine. So it's important to know that you could get a positive result for one of these rare conditions. And odds still are, even with that positive or increased risk result, about 20% of people who get one of those positive results for these rare syndromes, they will go on to have it confirmed with more accurate testing. But remember that 80% of people, they find out that their baby does not have it when they do follow-up testing. So it's really important for you to consider, do you want that extra information? Do you want to kind of have to deal with this nuanced information and have to think about follow-up testing, which is invasive and requires a needle going through your abdomen to collect a sample of amniotic fluid or placenta? There's very low risk with that diagnostic testing, but there is a small risk for miscarriage following the procedure. So do you want this extra information that might alert you, and a very small chance that it could alert you to a very rare syndrome, but a syndrome that will be impactful on somebody's quality of life? Or would you prefer to opt out of it because the nuance is too much? It's up to you. And you can go into the specific syndromes that are screened, but patients need counseling to make that decision. And in my experience, some patients, they'll say, I want that test. I want all the information that's available to me. That's great. Okay, I understand it's nuanced, and I understand I shouldn't panic right away if I get a positive result for one of those conditions. I'll do the testing. And I'd say, okay, great. If you do happen to be one of those rare individuals who has a positive result, I'm going to follow up with you and we are going to work through it. But generally speaking, here's what your options would be. Do nothing, do invasive testing to see what's going on, and so forth. And then the third option, so we talked about no testing, non-invasive prenatal testing. There's also an older school type of screening. In a different category is the diagnostic testing that I just described, the amniocentesis or the CVS. And there is this huge difference. There's a very big difference between screening like NIPT or NIPS, what we're talking about, what this New York Times article is talking about, and diagnostic testing like amniocentesis or CVS. Diagnostic testing like the amnio or CVS, those are the invasive tests that need a sample from the placenta or from the fetus, or amniotic fluid, I should say. Those tests are the tests that you can make medical decisions off of. Those are the tests where you can say, okay, with this result, we can be 99.5% certain or greater that the baby has or doesn't have X, Y, or Z. With non-invasive prenatal screening, there is more room for error, and there could be significantly more room for error depending on the syndrome. The take-home point here is that whether it is the OB having this conversation, a genetic counselor that the OBs hire, a genetic counselor that works for the labs offering the testing, most patients need a detailed conversation to decide what type of testing they want to consent to, how they want to receive the results, and to understand what repercussions these results might have on them. And this testing isn't right for everyone. Everyone will make a different decision about how much information they want or whether they want any information at all. And that's just fine. Usually I find these decisions are fueled based on how anxious someone is about their pregnancy, kind of their own worldview. Like, do I know somebody with Down syndrome? What do I think about syndromes like X, Y, and Z? Feelings and thoughts on abortion, feelings and thoughts on, wow, would I want to talk to surgeons? Would I want to deliver at a different hospital? Would I want a different birth plan if I knew my baby was at risk or affected with a genetic condition? And that's exactly what genetic counselors are here for. We are here to help patients understand genetic testing results, and help them or facilitate decisions that they make. We don't make the decisions for them. So I would never tell anybody, you should have this test. You need to have this test. We are just there to explain the different options and help answer their questions so they can make the best decision for them and for their pregnancy.
Wow. I mean, We're talking about testing for rare conditions. So as you're saying, most of these are going to come negative.
Yes.
But for the positive ones, you're saying as many as more than 80% of them, 80 out of 100 of those positive tests could be incorrect?
Yeah, and the numbers can get even higher. There's one test we looked at for a condition that occurs in about 1 in 20,000 births. We found that 93% of the positive results for that test turn out to be wrong on further testing. So it's a pretty big share. And again, these are the tests that are being sold in that marketing that is talking about total confidence, peace of mind, clear results. These are some of the tests being sold with that type of language.
Okay, I felt like they're going a little bit far with this marketing. So I wanted to take a look and see exactly what's out there. And I decided to just pull up Panorama and Maternity 21 and take a look at their marketing information that's geared towards patients. So let me just shrink down my video here. Okay, so this is Panorama, one of the most popular or most widely used types of NIPT. It screens for chromosome conditions that affect a baby's health, yes. Delivers the most accurate non-invasive prenatal testing on the market. I mean, I don't know who decides most accurate, but that very well could be true. Yep, it's a reliable way of non-invasively assessing a baby's health from a single blood draw from the mother. They should maybe change that to the person carrying the pregnancy, but yeah. Okay, Panorama offers a personalized risk score, which indicates whether your baby is at high or low risk for genetic disease. Your report could state the following. Low risk. Okay, I love the way Panorama's website explains this. So they're not saying even positive or negative. They're saying either there's a low risk that your baby is affected or there's a high risk. And look, it's very clear right here to me. A high risk result does not mean your baby has a chromosome abnormality. It indicates a high probability that your baby may have that condition. And then there's different follow-up tests, follow-up options. So, like I've mentioned before, no irreversible pregnancy decisions, they just mean abortion or termination, should ever be made based on a Panorama result. That's right, because this is a screening tool. You need to have a more accurate test, the most accurate test, amnio or CVS, before you would decide to terminate a pregnancy. And then, yeah, sometimes there can be an inconclusive result. So I actually think this is really nice. Okay, so let's look at Maternity 21's website. As early as 9 weeks. It screens for, so it's not saying it diagnoses chromosome abnormalities. It's screening for them and provides you with information early in pregnancy. So this Maternity 21 looks for chromosome abnormalities called trisomy. So that's the extra copy of a chromosome. It looks for Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13. But it digs deeper. Screening for sex chromosome aneuploidies, yep. And select microdeletions. Yeah. While rare, these chromosome abnormalities can have profound consequences. Here's what it looks for. Some microdeletions it looks for. Clear results. This test delivers clear positive or negative results for well-known chromosome abnormalities. Return in 5 days. So, when it says it delivers clear positive or negative results, yes, it says either you have a positive result on the screen, meaning you have an increased risk that your fetus is affected with this condition, or negative, decreased risk. But I agree, of course, it would be great if this website was more clear like Panorama's and spelled it out. That doesn't guarantee that your baby has the condition or doesn't have the condition. It's just pointing you that it's more likely to or less likely to. Okay, let's carry on.
I know that you've owned the medical billing. These companies, I'm sure, are frightened at the idea of a Sarah Kliff email. But what did they actually say when you took your findings to them?
So they said, many acknowledged our findings.
Wait, a lot of these companies did the studies. Yeah, of course they acknowledged their findings. No, none of these companies, and I have not worked for Natera or LabCorp, and I do not currently work for any company, any genetic testing laboratory, But yeah, these companies, no, none of these companies are trying to say that their test has a 100% accuracy for microdeletions. That's just not the case. And I think these companies advertise them as screening tools. I don't think the disconnect is between researchers and these companies that offer NIPT and sell it. The disconnect is between the providers who order these tests on behalf of their patients and their patients. The providers need to understand what they're ordering and order what their patients want and explain it to them correctly. And that's it. That's the disconnect. It's not with the companies.
They still believe there's value in this type of screening test because it is picking up the true positives, that it is finding some of these cases of disorders that parents would not have known about otherwise. And that they said
some of the results that do come back high risk or positive, those babies are impacted with these significant syndromes. So yeah, that's the goal of the testing. And some people want it all. Some people want all of the genetic testing you can have, even when there are complicated nuances.
They try their best to be very, very clear that it is a screening test. It is not a diagnostic test. The patient should be counseled on this test before. So essentially be told, here's what a positive result would mean for you. So they are making the case that these tests are doing more good by identifying cases of disease. But that experience they talk about, how each patient should be counseled, how they should give consent for these tests, that was really different than the experience I heard about interviewing, more than a dozen women who had received a positive result that turned out to be wrong.
And I'm very saddened to hear that people have spent weeks and months thinking that their baby was affected with a really severe disease and researching it and stressing about it and telling family about it or maybe hiding it when really it was just a false positive result. I'm really sad to hear that. But I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all because, a lot of people who order these tests, a lot of OBs that order these tests aren't fully educated on what they're ordering, unfortunately. And that means that their patients are not getting the counseling they need to understand what results come back.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. What is the experience of these women who are getting the positive results? Because, of course, when they receive that test result, they don't know it's a false positive, right? So how does what is seemingly very, very bad?
Well, duh, if you knew it was a false positive and you knew what a false positive is, you wouldn't be worried because that would mean your fetus doesn't have the condition. So yeah.
News being received by these women.
I had, multiple women describe this as the worst time of their lives, the time between when they received this result and when they later learned that the result was wrong. And, I met a lot of these women through the Reddit forum I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. One that really stands out to me is a woman named Yael Geller, who, spent a year of fertility treatments trying to get pregnant with her second child and was so excited when her pregnancy test was positive. She had a normal.
Yeah. As somebody who's had a false positive on newborn screening, so the screening that my sonny had done right when he was born in the hospital, and he came back positive, meaning that he could be affected with a genetic disease. It turned out to be a false positive. After about 8 more weeks of follow-up testing, we found that out. Yeah, it's absolutely freaking terrifying. And it is the last thing you want is this perfect baby that you've dreamed about for years or months to not be perfect, to not be that perfect baby you thought. It is terrifying. It made me throw up instantly when I got my results. It's awful. Yeah, these women have had terrible experiences because unfortunately they didn't have the upfront counseling in advance of getting these results back of what it would mean if a positive came back. Yeah, that's terrifying. And maybe these were the type of women who wouldn't have wanted that type of testing if they understood and they knew upfront that there was a chance that these results could lead to a false positive. They might have opted out of doing it and declined it. And my heart goes out to anybody who's gone through fertility treatments and then finds out that something's wrong or something could be wrong or developing differently than you want.
She told her 3-year-old about this brother or sister that was in her tummy. It seemed like everything was finally working. And she is driving her son home from school one day when she gets this call saying she had screened positive for a condition, she didn't even know she was being screened for. It's called Prader-Willi syndrome.
That's terrible. She's driving her kid home and gets this call and they're trying to explain it to her. That's awful.
And it's a pretty pretty serious condition.
Okay, I'm going to skip through the rest of this story because you get the point. So what ends up happening is that this woman decides to do follow-up diagnostic testing, the invasive testing like amniocentesis, and that amniocentesis comes back normal, meaning that her pregnancy is not affected with this condition, with Prader-Willi syndrome. There's this lasting emotional impact from the whole stress of the situation, and it takes time to wait for that diagnostic test and get those results back. So that's kind of the take home of the story.
I mean, these screenings introduce something that has such a potentially big impact on these women at such a...
That's the whole point of genetic screening, is to identify things that could have a big impact on an individual or an individual's pregnancy. No genetic counselor, or to my knowledge, none of these genetic testing laboratories have ever given out a guarantee that the screening is 100% accurate.
Fraught time, but do so with such little accuracy. Did the company speak to...
Okay, I know Sarah Kliff, the scientific investigator, has said this multiple times, but I don't like that the whole test is kind of being dragged down here. The accuracy for things like Down syndrome is excellent. It is very, very good. But yes, the accuracy or the positive predictive value for these certain microdeletion syndromes is not as good. It's not as good. But that is crystal clear on the results reports. And I'm going to even just pull up a screenshot of mine to show you. All right, I'm back. Got a refill on my drink, and I thought I would go through my own NIPT results just to give you a little bit of an idea of what they look like. What I want to do is draw attention to the fact that Panorama separates the chromosome syndromes. They're also called aneuploidies, like Down syndrome, trisomy 21, from the microdeletions. And you can see I had one microdeletion tested for, and I came back low risk. Where I think New York Times missed the mark is on the fact that the labs are very transparent about the fact that this testing doesn't have a super high positive predictive value for microdeletions. You can see it right here. The positive predictive value is good for Down syndrome. And again, positive predictive value, or PPV, that means if you get a positive result, your baby or pregnancy is actually affected. So 91% of people who get a result that says you have an increased risk for Down syndrome actually have a pregnancy affected with Down syndrome. The remaining 9% don't. They had a positive screen, but that screen was a false positive. And you can see for these microdeletions, yeah, the positive predictive value is much less. But the thing that a lot of people focus on is this negative predictive value. If you have a negative or low risk result, it is very, very unlikely your baby's affected. So yeah, the data is all here. It's all spelled out. There's even definitions here for providers and for patients. And if you have questions, you can even call these labs. Their phone number's always included on the results report, and most, if not all, NIPT labs have genetic counselors. And oftentimes those genetic counselors can speak with you or speak with your physician to explain anything that's not clear. So in my professional opinion, I think that the labs are being transparent about their predictive values. I just think that there is this big gap between providers and patients, and how patients are being consented and whether they're choosing the test that's right for them.
To this kind of emotional question, did they recognize that this isn't just a small thing, that they're introducing a really big variable into these folks' lives without, accuracy?
Yes, they do. Genetic counselors do. We definitely recognize that.
Yeah, I think the thing I heard a lot from the companies is that there should be this whole universe that surrounds their tests, that there should be genetic counseling before you get the test. There should be informed consent by the doctor saying, I'm testing you for these things. And that afterwards, everyone should have access to some kind of genetic counseling if they do get a positive result that can walk them through what this actually means. In practice, though, that universe just doesn't seem to exist for a lot of women who are getting positive results. We're finding that they are, done in quick prenatal appointments. Some doctors decide not to run these tests because they find them quite unreliable. I talked to a number who said, I would not use this on my patients. And some of those who do, we found in our reporting, talking to patients, just didn't seem to understand what exactly a positive result on this test meant. You also see doctors operating in an ecosystem where they are dealing with advertising that former FDA officials tell us is misleading, raises red flags. In one case, an ad for doctors with numbers that were described as meaningless by a former FDA official. So they're in a universe where the advertising isn't regulated. They're ordering a lot of tests for their patients and might not fully understand what it means when one of them comes positive for the test that we're writing about.
Okay, you shouldn't order a test if you don't know what it is. Duh, like that's a no-go. You either need to learn what the test is or not order it, or hire people who know what the test is to educate you and to educate your patients. Like you can't order a test when you don't know how to interpret it or what it is. That's the whole thing where I think this is missing the mark. Again, I'm a New York Times subscriber. I love that the Daily is spending a whole episode on genetic testing, but where I think they're missing the mark is that genetic testing is nuanced, and it's not just NIPT, it's all different types of genetic tests. It's direct-to-consumer tests like 23andMe. It's carrier screening testing. It's all nuanced and it's complicated. And the decisions that surround whether or not to complete the testing, what your options are once you do have those results in hand, and how you're going to navigate your next steps, it's really complicated. And a lot of providers and a lot of patients want it to be straightforward. They want it to be like, okay, I got my results. Now what do I do? Are they good or are they bad? But they're not always one or the other. A lot of times there's something in between. And importantly, a lot of different people will make different decisions based on their own worldview and their own preferences with results. There's not a universal right or wrong decision with a lot of genetic tests. So yes, there is this universe surrounding genetic testing, it's complicated. And unfortunately, again, our healthcare system in the United States sucks, and doctors don't have the time to explain, or they sometimes don't have the knowledge to explain the nuances of genetic testing. And unfortunately, there's this huge barrier in that not everyone can access genetic counselors or genetic testing, and then they miss out on having this information or having a good understanding of the information in front of them. So I think that to me is the take-home point, is that we have all of these amazing tools and genetic testing continues to develop and change and improve, but we don't have the time in our healthcare, the resources in our health system in the United States for people to access the medical tests that are available to them and to get the counseling they need to understand what they wish to do or not to do and their results.
How is it possible that such an inaccurate test is allowed to be marketed to doctors in the first place, or is allowed to be marketed to patients as something that should give them peace of mind? I feel
because people want more. Doctors want more. I see a lot of parallels to this and the type of genetic testing that's popular in IVF. You can test embryos for chromosome imbalances like Down syndrome. And people want it, even though it's not perfect. People want to screen for things in general. That's what I see and I hear as a genetic counselor who talks to multiple patients every single day. People want more, even when there's nuances, even when it's complicated. Now, I'm not saying all people. Some people say, let me leave it up to God. We'll see what happens. I'm not interested in that. And that is absolutely their choice. But a lot of people want it. If it's available, they want it. And these are companies, they are trying to set themselves apart, like the article discussed, as the podcast discussed earlier.
Like we have a highly regulated medical industry. How can this happen?
Yeah, so these tests exist in a world where they do not get Food and Drug Administration oversight. They are pretty much exempt from that regulatory agency, which usually looks after blood tests and MRIs and all the sorts of other things we get in doctor offices. They're what's known as a laboratory developed test, a test that was made in a laboratory, is run in that same laboratory. And for kind of wonky historical reasons, these tests are exempt from FDA oversight, which means there's no one really reviewing the claims. There's no one looking over the data behind these tests to say, are the claims about what they're saying accurate? It's basically test makers.
But it's really clear to me after looking and showing my own NIPT result and looking at the websites for these NIPTs that they aren't making any false claims. What they're doing is really clear on their website and on their results report.
Designing their studies, creating data, and deciding how they want to describe that data to patients and doctors.
It's giving Theranos vibes. I mean, how?
No. I mean, lots of direct-to-consumer-y things, and all sorts of like preventative medicine companies out there do give me Theranos vibes, but this NIPT testing, it's not giving me Theranos vibes.
How is this not what you're describing, just a big loophole?
Yeah. So I want to be clear again, this is not Theranos. The down screening is a good product that a lot of obstetricians really think is a great development.
Yes.
But when you get into these newer tests, there are a lot of obstetricians and geneticists that are questioning their value. And at the end of the day, it leads to, some important diagnoses for, cases where they find true positives, but a lot of anguish and, a lot of stress for the women who are getting the false positives that are more common than the true ones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I'm going to fast forward a little bit because there's nothing too interesting here for a while.
Mm-hmm. So what should folks take away from that? If you are a pregnant woman listening to this podcast, should you get the test?
Yeah, as a pregnant woman taping this podcast, it's a question I care a lot about. And, what I think they should take away is one, that the down screening is a reliable product. The body that governs obstetricians, they recommend that screening. They also recommend the screenings for trisomy 18 and 13. They feel like those are really accurate enough and have the data to, be recommended to all pregnant women in the United States. But
not quite. It's not necessarily that the test is recommended, like all people who are pregnant should complete the test. It's more like, well, let me pull it up. Prenatal genetic screening, like cell-free DNA screening, that's another name for the NIPT that we're talking about. Option should be discussed and offered to all pregnant patients, regardless of what's going on with them. And after review and discussion, every patient has the right to pursue or decline prenatal genetic screening and diagnostic testing, the testing with the higher level of accuracy, that invasive testing. So it's not saying that it's recommended everyone complete it. It's recommended that every patient knows about it and knows all of the information they need to make an informed decision to pursue that testing or to decline that testing. And then it says here, again, very clear recommendations. These are the guidelines that obstetricians and gynecologists should follow. Cell-free DNA testing, this NIPT, again, is the most sensitive and specific for common aneuploidies like Down syndrome. But it does have the potential for false positives and false negatives. So it is not as good and it is not equivalent to diagnostic testing, the amnio and the CVS. You should not make medical decisions based on it. Also says patients with positive screening results. So in the case of these stories that Sarah's telling us about women who've had a positive screening result, they should undergo genetic counseling and have a detailed ultrasound and the option to complete diagnostic testing. And then for any patient who receives a negative screening result, well, they should be informed that this decreases their risk, but it does not guarantee the fetus is unaffected.
If they want to pursue these other tests, or if their doctor suggests they pursue these other tests, they should really go into that with their eyes open about what a positive result really means.
You should go into any genetic test with your eyes wide open. You should have your eyes wide open about billing and how much it's going to cost you, and if there's cheaper options and whether your insurance covers it. Your eyes should be wide open about, what would I do if the result is positive? What would I do if the result is negative? Every genetic test, they're almost always complicated and lead to you needing to make a potential medical decision for yourself or a family member. So yes, eyes wide open. You want genetic testing? Open your eyes. Speak with a genetic counselor. Speak with your provider.
Most expectant parents, including myself, get a negative result on these tests and they don't really think twice about it. And
I thought twice. I thought a lot of times about my negative test. I felt really good. I felt really reassured to know that my result was negative, meaning I had a reduced risk for the syndromes that my pregnancy was screened for.
And go on with their pregnancy. But, I would think about going into this kind of prepared with your eyes open of, what am I being screened for?
Yes.
How often are the positive results right?
Yes.
And if I get a positive result, what happens next? And thinking of it, I guess, less as, all upside. You're just going to learn something about your pregnancy, but that there are really risks that come along with taking a test like this.
There are risks with all genetic tests. Yes. Yes. It is complicated.
It seems like you're describing a situation kind of that the company said was the ideal one, that there would be that risk communication, that there would be that level of counseling and understanding of kind of what you're getting into, but that without that, it produces some of the experiences of the women that you talk to.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the infrastructure for that is not there right now. One genetic counselor I interviewed for this story said there just aren't enough of them to counsel all 4 million women who are pregnant. There just aren't enough genetic counselors.
All right, genetic counselors, I'm sad that somebody said that, because we are smart. We can come up with solutions on how to make sure that every single person who wants NIPT or has questions about NIPT can get the answers they need, whether it's more genetic counselors to educate OBs or more focus going into training for the medical professionals who are offering and ordering the test, or requiring that patients listen to a short webinar or a short video before they get that testing in their office, where this information is reviewed. There are ways around it, even though genetic counseling is a relatively small profession. But yes, this is all the more reason why genetic counseling is growing, because genetic testing is getting more and more complicated.
There are not enough time in these short prenatal care visits to really go through an informed consent process right now. So I think that ideal world is one that can be envisioned, but in terms of turning it into reality, we are pretty far from that right now. One thing that could stand in for the infrastructure is some kind of government regulation, where instead of, me as a patient asking my doctor all these questions, the government could be regulating the information that these test makers put out. They could say, you can't make that claim about having total confidence in every result, or you have to.
Now, this is a point I can kind of get behind. I wish that the over-exaggerated hyperbolic language that you see on a lot of laboratories' websites wasn't there. There is no test that can guarantee you a perfect baby. There is no test that can tell you everything. There is no 100% accurate test. The general claims like this test will guarantee you peace of mind that aren't numeric. They're not quantitative. Yeah, I could do without those. I don't know exactly how that can be regulated, but sure, I could do without those.
Publish better data on how many of your positive results are right or wrong. But without that kind of oversight, this seems like an area of prenatal testing that is, going to keep growing, and the onus will really be on patients and their doctors to sort through some pretty complex information that took, me and another reporter.
Should be on the doctors, just like patients don't, or hopefully shouldn't have to come up with their own cancer treatment regimen. Their doctor is supposed to come up with that. So yeah, it should be on the doctors, not the patients, to explain.
About 4 months to sort through to get to, a really good understanding. And that feels.
I'm really appreciative that an article came out on genetic testing that it was highlighted on the daily, but I'm just really sad and worried that it's going to deter patients from this testing that would otherwise want it, because it might lead to even more confusion. I wish that the podcast had a genetic counselor being interviewed in it to kind of clarify things and to explain some of the different options and the different testing. And in my opinion, this is more of a failure of how our healthcare system is, that OB appointments are too short, doctors don't have enough time or training on genetic testing, and there's not access to free services for enough people. I kind of think it's more of a critique on that.
Feels like quite a burden to put on the expectant parents of America to do that exact kind of sorting.
Just forcing every expectant parent to just become an investigative journalist.
We could use a few more, but I don't think this is the right way to do the recruiting.
Okay, that's it. I thought I should get my reaction out there. I think those of you who are interested in genetic counseling school, this is a really important topic for you to be informed about, and an interesting topic to stay on top of. I know this testing is going to continue to improve. So just something cool. When I went to school, NIPT it was just becoming available. And when I had my first Sunny about 5.5 years ago, I did not have NIPT testing. And now it's very different. As you heard from the article, a third of people in the US who are pregnant have the testing done. If you want to hear more chatter about what genetic counselors think about the associated article, the one that was called, I'll just pull it up. When they warn of rare disorders, these prenatal tests are usually wrong with this graphic. If you want to hear more about what genetic counselors think, there's a good discussion going in GC Chat on Twitter. And I know Dina DNA is planning to come out with some more information. So there's stuff out there. If you are pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant and you are confused about this testing, please ask your doctor. If your doctor doesn't know or is wishy-washy about something, please ask them to connect you with a genetic counselor. If they don't know how to connect you with a genetic counselor, please call the laboratory who is doing your testing or the lab who is who your physician works with to order this testing and ask to speak with one of their genetic counselors. We are here to help. Let me know what you thought of this reaction video, and I hope you guys have a great night. Maybe you'll see this up on the 5th. I don't know. I might be up all night. Just first day back at work, staying up all night, restarting my YouTube career. I'm almost at 1,000 subscribers, so if you guys could tell your friends about my channel, anyone who likes genetic counseling, interested in genetic counseling, I need 5 more subscribers to hit 1,000. And I also got these fancy new backlights. Let me know what you think. All right. Good night, guys.